Hello, my name is Sharon Gray, and today I'm going to teach you how to paint this scene. Before we start painting, I'm going to go through some of the difficulties that we're going to face, because in watercolor painting you always have to plan ahead. In effect, you have to paint the whole thing in your head before you ever start painting it on your paper. Because in watercolors, it's a transparent medium, which means you layer the colors over each other, kind of like tainted glass or tinted glass, but you can't scrub out mistakes very easily, and it's not opaque like acrylics or oils, so you can't layer colors over in order to cover mistakes very easily. And that means lots of planning is required. So what makes this piece interesting is that you have a few little details that are in really high contrast with crisp, clean edges, like this bird and the branch and this little bit of a stick over here on the left. I want to preserve all of that, but what makes it really interesting is that the background is very, very loose. You can't see any detail in the background at all, but you can see this bright color splotch here and this dark one here. And notice that it's the dark color that gives us the cleaner quality of the edges, and that's that really interesting high contrast here. So we definitely want to preserve that. So, moving over to your watercolor paper, if you're painting on watercolor paper like this, make sure that you have it stretched, which is to say you soak it wet, and then after about 5 minutes, you let it drip dry, then put it down on your board and staple it. After doing that, I like to go one step more and tape the edges so that when the piece is done, I have a nice clean border. And as I tape the edges, I want to keep the proportions of this original reference material in mind. See how it's a long skinny rectangle? I want to keep it a long skinny rectangle on my painting too. Just because the fewer changes you have to make from your reference material, the better you're going to be, especially if you're just starting. So I'm going to use some masking tape, and I'm going to tape right over the edges here. Since I want my rectangle to be longer than it is wide, I'm going to tape in more at the top and bottom than I do at the sides. But I do want all of those staples to be covered, because it has a tendency to pick up. The edges have a tendency to pick up, and the paper might tear a little bit if you don't tape over those staples. Not the end of the world if it does tear, but it's easy enough to avoid, so that's why I tape. Now I'm working fairly small, mainly because of the filming, but it's easy to make this, it's easy to transpose your painting into whatever size you want. All you have to do is measure the length and width and then create a proportionate scale from your reference material to your finished paper. In this case, I'm just going to eyeball it because this is a pretty low detail painting. So I think that this looks about right. I might want to move it up a little bit more even. There we go, that's good. So this is just eyeballed, or in other case, or in other words, guessed. But I could make it exactly precise, as I was saying, by just measuring the length and the width of my reference material, and then making corresponding proportions of length and width on my paper. But we don't need to get into that now, because in this case it's very, very loose, it's very low detail, and I feel like I can draw it accurately enough to maintain the good qualities of the piece without going through the extra fuss of the scale. So we'll do the scaling in a different piece. But for now, let's get started drawing the bird, the stick, these little leaves, and this little stick. I'm using a graphite pencil and I have at hand a kneaded eraser. I always work with a kneaded eraser because it's soft and so it doesn't damage the tooth of the paper, but it picks up well enough that I can fix my mistakes and it doesn't leave crumbs behind either. So I'm going to start by marking off the approximate places for this stick. I'm not just going to draw a stick on my paper. What I do is I like to look at it in terms of the overall frame. So here the stick bisects at this point, and here it bisects here and here. Okay, so then I can judge that this is about a third of the way in, and this is a little bit under halfway. So if I go over to my piece now, here would be halfway, here would be a little bit under halfway. I'll make a mark there on my tape. Then I'm going to go and eyeball about a third. And that way I know my stick needs to end here and here. And within those more general confines, it's going to be simpler to draw the stick. And it curves a little bit, then it tapers off and gets quite skinny. So here it is, fat. It's simple to draw a stick, and yet in the same way that everything is important, you need to make sure that your stick is fat enough to support the weight of this bird on it. So if it's really skinny and scrawny, you're going to actually break down the realism of your piece. Okay, don't worry about details on the stick. The next thing that we're going to do is rough in the bird. So the placement of the bird and the size of the bird in proportion to the rest of the drawing is quite important. See how he's kind of swallowed up by color here? That makes him more of a little interesting target in this piece. So your eye goes straight here, but there's also a lot going on in the background, so it doesn't bullseye you in. It's just one more thing that you're looking at. It's the first thing that you look at, to be sure, but don't get your bird too big. That's the point, because you want to have room for this interesting background as well. So before you actually draw the bird, just draw a circle. Is that circle about how big you want your bird to be? It can't be right down on the branch, remember, because you have to leave room for his legs. So I'll draw some little legs here, just really sketchy. And then within this very loose circle, I'll develop the little head and the body a bit more. And make sure that you take your time, even with this simple form, because in everything there's a lot going on. The tilt of his head, the placement of his eye, the little beak here, all of those really add to the whimsical, charming quality of this bird, and therefore to the whole piece, because it is a painting of a bird. So you need to make it really good. As you go along and you're doing your drawing, make sure that you clean up any sketchy lines with that kneaded eraser. And you can even erase them completely and then redraw more carefully. Now I'm using a 1B, but that's because the lines are dark enough that they show up well on film. Normally when I'm drawing, I draw with like a 2H pencil. Those lines are going to be lighter and they're even easier to erase. Don't be afraid if you wind up with pencil marks on your finished painting that you can see. It's not the end of the world. Some people get a little tense about it, but a lot of famous watercolorists, you can still see their pencil lines through the paint. I'll add a beak and I'll add an eye, but just because I did it this size and shape the first time doesn't mean that it's right. So I need to give myself some time to look over the bird and make sure that I have the eye and everything right. The way that you give yourself time is by getting up away from the piece, walking around, just looking at anything else, and then coming back to it with fresh eyes. And at that point, you can see your mistakes a lot more easily. And sometimes, even in the sketching phase, I add a little bit of tone to places that are really dark, because it's hard to determine if you have things down the right size if they're dark and you haven't filled them in at all. I'm going to want to erase that tone before I start painting, but just for now. And I'll finish up with these leaves. Pan out again. So the leaves are going to cover the bottom of the branch here, and they go up to about the height of the bird's head. They're just a little bit above the bird's head. So that is a good indication for where I want to put them on my piece. Always give yourself little guides like that and draw one thing in terms of another object you've already drawn. That way you're going to wind up with a lot more accuracy. You don't have to erase as many mistakes, and you're going to be able to stick to the original reference material a lot better without too much effort. So don't draw blind. You never have to draw blind. Usually you don't need to worry about matching every leaf. You don't in this case either, but there's so few that it's going to be quite easy to just draw what you see. And if you've drawn the reference material accurately, it's going to be easier when you come to the painting phase for you to just paint each leaf according to the color that you see on the reference material instead of having to guess at any of your leaves. And then it ends with this branch that pokes up on this side. Okay, now I already pointed out that this has really strong contrast right here. In order to maintain that strong contrast with watercolors, you're going to need to protect the edges with masking fluid or frisket film. They both essentially do the same thing. Frisket film is like a big sticker that you put over your painting, and masking fluid is this. It's fluid that you squeeze out and you can protect your lines. So what I'm going to do off camera, because it takes a little bit of time to dry, but I'll show you here the basic process, is I'm just going to squeeze the masking fluid carefully, if it will come out. Yep, there we go. And protect this branch that's sticking out. Any highlight edges on the leaves and the entire bird, and at least the upper line of this branch. So I'm looking for edges of light. I can only keep these light by protecting them before I ever start painting. And see how there's kind of a halo of light around the bird, and you can see these little tiny feathers? I have to protect those with the masking fluid as well. So I'm going to put down my masking fluid, let it dry, and then I'll come back and show you how to start painting. Okay. The lines are protected and the painting is ready to actually be painted now. So I want to, so before we start that, I'm going to do a quick rundown on what you're going to need. Obviously, you need some brushes. for small pieces, you're not going to use anything bigger than a 1-inch flat brush like this. Then I have this is one of my favorite brushes. This is a number 6 round. I have a 1/2 inch round, or flat rather. And then I have some smaller rounds like zeros and double zeros. So you don't need to break the bank with your brushes. You can get really good quality white sable bristles from different websites now that are very affordable and last extremely well. Then you're going to need some paint in a palette. You choose the colors based on what you want to paint, of course. And I also have a little sponge that'll be good for texturing and for lifting out paint if we have any accidents. And always paper towels and my spritz bottle for water. I like a spritz bottle like this because it has a fine mist so that I can get a variety of different effects and it doesn't put too much water on the page. Just a light sprinkle of it will give a nice dappled texture that you can use for a lot of different things. So I actually have used many different spritz bottles and water bottles and spraying implements throughout the years, and I've settled on just recycling things that I like the feel of from other products. So for instance, this is originally a detangling spray bottle, and this is my other bottle that I like to use a lot, and that had cleaning chemicals in it. So of course you just have to wash that out really well once you've used it up, and there you go. You might also find something like this useful. This is a spray bottle that I got online. And just you put a little hole in the tip with a pen, and that way you can make the hole as small or big as you want. So let's get started. Now, oh goodness, the other thing that you really need, test strips. These are scrap pieces of watercolor from paintings that didn't make the cut, but I flip them over. I tear out little squares and then I flip them and mark then I make a little 1-inch square punch in it, and that's going to enable me to put the paint right up against what I'm trying to match. So I'll mix up my paint it right here next to it, and then take it to my painting and see how close I got. So really indispensable, very cheap, but you do need to get a 1-inch square punch if you want to make those yourself. Of course, you don't have to have them be precise. They can just have a little hole punch in them. But now, before we start the background, I wanted to point out these colors are very different from the background, the branch and the bird, and they have really sharp contrast because these lines are so definite. But here in these leaves, there's not nearly as much contrast. See, the green is juxtaposed against more green, and you have a kind of a light yellow green here. So what I want to do is paint those first, then let them dry and protect them with masking fluid, and then do the background. And the reason I'm going to do it that way is because you get a cleaner edge when you're painting light on dark if the light has already been painted and then you end up with the dark. I hope that makes sense. Basically, if I used masking fluid on these first and painted the background, when I removed that masking fluid, the line edges would be very sharp and white, and then I would have to very carefully try to fill that in, but it always looks a little bit like a coloring book. It doesn't look as natural as I want. So I'm going to paint them first. So use the largest brush you can for the area. I'm going to use the 1/2-inch flat, and I'm going to paint with clean water over each leaf first of all. The clean water will make sure that you have a nice color that fills in and looks realistic, and it's going to dry really smoothly and not have any of those semi-dry spots that tend to take away from the realism of your objects. You don't want things to look painted. They might not look absolutely real, but you don't want the paint strokes to be distracting. Okay? And also, this method is called water masking, and it's going to allow me to have just more control because the paint is going to follow the water. It's not going to go everywhere. So I'm going to be able to put the color in quite quickly. I'm going to mix up a green with a yellow and some blue to do some color match. Oh my gosh. Gosh. I hit it pretty well there on the first try, so that's what I'm going to use. And then see how I can just fill this in. I don't want to fill it in completely evenly though. Again, coloring book. So I like to lift up my brush, and it gives you a little bit of a dibble of extra heavy color so that you get some variation of dark to light. And then also go back in with a second color, like a darker blue or something, and just hit it again. You want colors to mix on the page, and you never want them to look too flat and unrealistic. So you really want to have some different things happening to make them interesting and to give them a little bit more depth. So you can also use that sponge or use a corner of a paper towel, and you can lift off a bit of color. So either by lifting out the color or adding a second color, just make sure that you're letting things mix on the page. And also be aware that your color is going to dry at least 1 or 2 shades, well, 2 or 3 shades lighter than it looks when you're painting it initially. So here it got pretty watery. That means it's going to dry and look like almost nothing. So if you want your colors to last, you need to paint them boldly. I'm just painting everything I see, trying to keep it really close to what's in the picture, but don't be a slave to the picture. You know, you're an artist, so you can make some artistic decisions. And then there's one leaf that has the light streaming through it. They get that really lovely, almost fluorescent color, much more yellow in it, just like this. I want the yellow to look a bit brighter in this one, so I'm going to blot out the color and then re-add my yellow. And then I'm going to add some yellow around the outside edge to some of these up here. I'm going to adjust my green a little bit, add a little bit more Kelly green. Yep, I like that better. But once that's done, now I'm going to let it rest, and I'm going to let those colors dry, and then I will cover them with masking fluid the same as this. Then we will come back and we'll start painting the background. Okay, the bird is protected, the stick's still protected, and now these painted flowers or leaves are protected as well. And so it is time to start the actual painting. Very exciting. The first thing that I'm going to do is soak the background. Not soak, but get it all nice and wet. So you don't want it to be dripping with standing water. It's just going to make it harder for you to make any lasting color. Then I just smooth out right over the top with a wet flat brush. One way and then the other. This ensures that I have a nice even coating and that my colors will mix freely. Now I'm just going to start putting in the color. So I like to start light to dark. I'm still matching the colors, and I'm going to try to put them in about the same place that I see them on the reference material. But there's a really bright yellow patch, and then down here, over here, and behind here. I started with the brightest one, and now as my color is fading, it's getting a little bit more washed out, which is good because that's what I see on the picture as well. And then you see how I'm just sort of adding some different colors in there. I need to add some blues and make some greens. So here I'll add in this interesting bluey color. This is exactly the kind of technique that is really great in watercolor. The watercolor just lends itself really well to this sort of thing. And I'm mixing up a green for around here, and I'm really just painting it the way I see it. You want to try to make sure that you activate your color entirely before you start the painting phase. Otherwise you're going to have little blobs of color that explode on the paper like this, and you have to go back and cover them up. Now what you want to do too is match the tone. The color isn't as important as the tone. So you have to have that same play between the lights and the darks to make it very interesting. So down here in this corner on the reference material, there's something really dark happening. I want to make sure that I keep that. So I'm going to go in there with some intense blue and Payne's gray. And as you work, you can squint at the reference material and see those shapes of shadows. You can put them down as large shapes. Now I'm going back in to some of these greens with some cerulean blue, and not stroking evenly over everything, but just kind of touching it in here and there. Touch, 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 like this. And that way I'll have this interesting mottled texture. Mottled, M-O-T-T-L-E-D. So you have these patches of light and dark. Don't forget those darks in the corners. Down here there's a dark corner. Up here it starts going a little bit dark. The reason that is so important is because the darkness, the contrast rather, is what pulls the viewer's eye. It's what keeps this bird from being a target in the composition. So you have to have those varying colors and those interesting patches so that you don't get stuck here. Your eye wants to go here, your eye wants to go here, your eye wants to go here. But it wants to go here too much right now. So what I'm going to do is soften those edges. I want to do it without actually painting. So I'm going to add a little bit more water with my spray bottle, and then I'm going to let the colors drift around on the page by just shifting back and forth and around and round. Now you have to watch what you're doing and watch what's happening to the page as you do this, because you don't want to wind up drowning your color or making everything muted. If you do it too long, everything will shift into non-existence and make mud on your page. So you just want to touch in and then When it looks like it's doing some interesting stuff, leave it alone. I'm going to touch back in with some more blues, but I'm really getting to max capacity on my paper here. So I need to put it away, let it dry completely, and then I can come back and reevaluate how it's going. Make sure that when you let it dry at this stage, you let it dry completely flat. Now the first pass has dried. Got a little hair in there, brush that off. But it's not looking exactly the way I want it to. I need this to go a lot darker and down here to go a lot darker. So as I expected, I'm gonna need to take another pass there. So I'm gonna show you another little trick that I like to do. You don't have to have these implements. If you don't have them, don't go out and buy them. But one little thing that I've discovered in my studio that's really indispensable for cool techniques like this in watercolor is a syringe. And then you can get a pack of them like this, going from really big to medium to small. And then they come with a little bag of needles of different gauges. They're not exactly needles though, they're not sharp. So they just have different size holes in them. And then what I like to do is to use mixing cups. Give me just a second, I'll grab some. You can get these plastic variety very inexpensively. And I just suck up some color from my palette with the syringe. And this mixing cup allows me to make whatever color I need. So maybe I want a mix of some dark blues and some Payne's gray and some browns. I can mix them all together in the mixing cup and then test my color before I apply it to my board. Since I have those different gauge needles, I can also swap out for larger needles if I need to. So here I have a nice dark, and then I'm going to suck it up into the needle again. So it's just like this. And then I'm going to drop it directly on the painting. And I can't tell you exactly why it looks better than painted techniques, because I don't exactly know, but it just does. So then I'm just going to hit it with a spray bottle, and part of it is that I'm really not doing any painting with a brush, so I can skip the brushing on step and then let these colors really glide around and do their own thing completely. And since it's thicker from the beginning, the color stays truer. It doesn't lighten up so much. Here I'll kind of guide it around with my finger, just because I haven't really done anything with the brush, so why change that now? Let it shift on its own. And for a soft sort of atmospheric effect like I'm going for, really can't beat it. I'm going to do one more color that same way, but this time I'm going to mix up a green. So I'll get some yellow. Another benefit of using the mixing cups is it keeps your palette a lot cleaner. It's difficult to keep your colors really pure in your palette cups when you're continually dipping in with a brush. So here I have a green mixed up, just the same way. And I'm going to drop it in. Whoop, whoop, whoop. If it starts spreading like that, actually it looks really cool. But if you don't want it to spread too much, just pick it up. My table's at a little tilt here, so I can just pick it up and keep those colors from bleeding. But see that really cool bleed that you get? Sometimes it's just exactly what you want. So now I'll just switch back and forth, and I'll add a little bit of yellow, some pure yellow into some of these areas. I'm doing the same thing as before, but now it's a little bit easier because I already have that base tone mixed up. The base tone is there on the white paper covering it, so I don't have to work so hard to cover up my space. You know, that much is already done for me. So now I'm just going back and adding a little bit more texture and interesting effects. And the best part is you can go as crazy as you want on the background because all of the essentials are protected. I'll do that spritz again. I'm just sort of encouraging the watercolor to paint itself. Don't do too much at a time with this effect though, because you will lose control. And I don't want to lose control too much. So now I'm just going to touch in with my pinky on the side here and there. Guide that color around just a bit more. That is looking very interesting. It looks a lot more interesting, in my opinion, than the first pass where I did the actual painting. You don't want to paint in a painting. But there really is something to that though. You get a stronger composition a lot of times if you vary up your techniques, like I was saying before. Here I just want to encourage the darks and the new color to bleed into what I had before so that it doesn't look like a place on the painting that has too stark of lines. So I'm just spraying, but notice I'm using a little spritz bottle, not a spray bottle. This is a spray bottle. It has a wider gauge and it's going to let loose a lot more water at once. So I'm going to have a lot more problems with drowning my color if I'm relying on spray bottles for things like this, not spritz bottles. So I really like this. I'm going to put it away again and let it dry one more time. Now I'm satisfied with the background. It looks really interesting and yeah, I'm liking it. I might soften up. No, I'm just going to be satisfied. Okay, so now let's remove our masking fluid off of everything. That means the leaves that we already painted and the twig and the bird. I'm just using a rubber cement eraser and rubbing this off. You can see how well that worked to keep everything nice and bright. Okay, now that that is all gone, we can start to paint the bird and the twig. So I'm going to start with the bright oranges in the bird's stomach. I'm going to paint with a fairly small round brush. And because I want those colors to stay really bright and vivid, I'm going to just use a wet brush with dry paper. Notice before you start painting that there's this really important halo of light around the bird, so don't paint all the way to the edge. You want to preserve that halo. That's what makes the objects really glow with life and vitality, and it makes them look three-dimensional. So there's really nothing more important than keeping that little halo intact. I just carefully paint around the eye. And then I'm going to use some yellow. Mix right in. Just like this. And I'm needing it to be a little bit more light up here, so I'm going to blot. There's almost a line that separates the chest from the head. You'll notice when you're painting this yourself. So I'm going to keep that intact. And by painting my pure colors first, my light colors that I want to have stay really bright, I'm going to have a better chance of not muddying up this area with my darks. So after that color is painted, if it's not too wet, so I don't want the colors to bleed, but I don't want there to be a lot of separation between these colors on the feathers, because they do touch and they almost need to be painted while the color underneath is still wet. So now I'm painting in this bluey gray, just very carefully. Short little strokes that look like feathers. And then down here, it doesn't matter if those colors blend together a little bit, because the orange is going to have the shading on it, and it gets a lot darker on this chest area. And then out here it goes back to a golden color. So while that's still dry, while it's still wet, I'm going to go in with this goldy color and let that mix as well. And you can see as I have given this a little bit of time, it starts to mix a little bit more and more. And importantly, I still have that halo all the way around. Even up here, there's still just a little bit of a rim. And the top of the head needs to go a bit darker. So now that I have it painted once, I'm touching in with a darker brown. I don't want to paint the beak though until everything is completely dry, because I don't want there to be any bleeding here. That wouldn't be realistic. So I'll wait to finish that, and I might go in and darken this again and wait until everything is completely dry before you paint the eye and the feet as well. But let's go and do some work in the twig. The twig is going to be pretty easy. It's just a mixture of grays and browns. The line has already been preserved for me, so I really just have to go back and kind of paint in this bottom side. I paint a bit and then I might change up the color a little bit and go from a gray to of a more ochre brown. Just follow your lines really carefully and make good use of the fact that you protected everything with the masking fluid. You can see though how I let the colors change, and sometimes I pick up the brush and I let it puddle, and as it puddles it's going to create a darker area, and that is how you get those really interesting watercolory effects. Then I want it to look rough, like a realistic stick. So I'm also going to wad up a paper towel and just blot out a little bit of texture. And then go back in and redarken, but don't redarken everything. So I'm just going to use that method where I pick up my brush, I let the color pool and puddle and form some interesting textures that way. The paper is still a little bit wet, so it's going to bleed, but only in a very specific small area. And then I have this sharp line of light here, and then all of this under the bird is in shadow a little bit. Do some of that on this little twig up here as well. Just pay attention to your reference material as you work and paint what you see. I know that sounds like really not helpful advice, but that is about all that there is to it. There's not a magic trick that you can do and just the painting appears before you. It really is going to be largely about observation and learning those techniques to make the painting do what you want it to do. So, like I was saying earlier, a lot of that is going to come down to knowing when to start painting according to how wet your paper is and so on. But here I've got some good texture. And now maybe just a really washed out gray on the top here and there so it doesn't look quite so bold. I want there to be a white and a dark, but I don't want it to be all just unpainted and look unfinished. So I'm blending out some of those lines with this washed out gray. I'm just taking it down a notch as far as contrasts. So that's looking good. Let me paint this leaf in the foreground. It's very yellow, and it's very bright. So I matched my yellow before I started painting. And that's about all there is to it. Go back into these other leaves now and polish them up as well. So that might mean touching into them with an overlay of yellow to brighten them up a little bit, or maybe a darker green here and there, something a little bit more vibrant. So I'll make this one a little bit more bright. Just like this. So you just take your time and you fill in. And then you take a step back from the painting and you add more detail where you think it needs to be. Always remembering though that detail is a dangerous thing. You only want as much as is needed for the viewer to be able to fill in the rest on their own. Don't overpaint. Don't overpaint those details especially. So now we're almost done. I just have to let the bird dry. Let's see, I need to give him a little bit more depth in his chest and his feathers here. So I'm going to go over right on his chest, make a shadow color. And I think I need to darken up his head a little bit more. Then I need to let those feathers dry and then add the beak and the eye, and we'll be about finished. So I'm going to let this dry one more time, come back and finish it for you then. All right, moving on with our bird. I'm going to get my rigger brush. The rigger brush is what you use for making nice, skinny little lines. It has long hairs like this. So it's a round brush, but it has these fine lines. It has long bristles, and then when you get it wet, it develops a nice sharp point. And I need it for making the branches between the leaves. So let's get this nice brown on the rigger, and then I can position my arm whatever way it feels like I have the most control, and just do one stroke, and you're done. Down there, let me see if this little trick will work. My background got a little dark, but if I wet the area where I want it to go, if my paint is still fresh enough, I can blot out that highlight line. See? Yeah, it worked really well. And now, even though it's the opposite of what it's supposed to be from the reference material, at least I didn't lose that branch completely. I think I'd rather have the branch than have no branch. So I'm going to blot it. All right, and then I'm going to go in with some darker brown, still on the rigger, and just sort of accent a little bit here and there in the branches. Maybe blot as I go, accent and then blot. Because that way you have a little bit more variation, a little bit more reality. These branches tend to be darker where they join together. And then on this branch too that the bird is standing on, I just want to give an indication of some bark, things like that. Little twigs that are standing up off the surface. So I'm just accenting little patterns in the bark, giving my twig a little bit more life. And making the underside of it a little bit darker. So I really want it to push back. Has to have good, strong contrast to do that. After adding those really intense darks, I go back before it can dry and I wet it. And this is going to keep it from looking like a big black line. Okay, I don't want it to look like an outlined branch. I want it to look like a branch that has real dimension. Then let's go into the bird's beak. Add a bit more. Be careful not to drag through anything that's wet. I'm going to add some details to his beak. And I'm being careful to maintain that little halo of light, even here at the beak. And I'll darken up the eye. Cute. And I'm going to use a larger round, and I need a shadow. So I'm mixing up a blue-gray, and this bird has sort of a little, not too dark, not too dark, but there's a shadow cast on the face. It's here, goes around into these feathers, and it goes here and ends right here. It's almost a line in the feathers. So make sure that it's not only the color that needs to be correct, it's the strength of the paint. So make sure that it's liquid enough that you can lay it down smoothly. And it won't cover too much. It will kind of look like a transparent wash over the top of everything. I'm still not quite satisfied with the chest, so I'm adding a little bit more shadow here. That's looking better. That's pushing it. Yep. And then the tail is quite dark. Don't forget that tail. Still with a little ring of light around the tail to Teensy, teensy, but it's there. Okay. And of course we have the feet, back to the rigger to put those in. We'll just need to take a breath and let it out to get the best control possible over those lines. Don't hold your breath. Okay, there's a little line in the beak. Good. This is looking quite good. So I want to let it rest. I might do a few more little picky details, but I am not sure. I'm just going to put it away for about an hour and then look at it and come back to you one last time. If there are any changes at that time, we'll make them. If not, it'll be a finished piece. Okay, we're back to the bird here, and all I did off screen was soften around some of these edges, really just a little bit here and there, so that you couldn't tell so much of a line with the white. And I feel now that it's good. I think that it's done. So there's just one more little trick I want to show you that sometimes you can use to your benefit. I like to use a little bit of aqua cover. I don't have any white paint, but sometimes you'll find that there is just a little tiny line that you lose, and the painting would be better if you could get that bright white back. So I just use a very small amount of aqua cover on a piece of scratch paper and a small round brush dipped into it, and there are some feathers on the bird's chest that I'm going to bring out that way. Sometimes you can't even tell the difference on the video, but I can see it here, and you'll be able to see it in your own studio. So I'm just going to use small, short brush strokes like this and make a few tiny, tiny hairs. And you don't have to have the white paint to get this effect, because another thing that you can do is go in with a background color and do the opposite. So instead of accentuating the white, you accentuate tiny green lines that match the background that go around the bird. Just like this. So I could divide up that green patch that I protected by going in with a negative color. And both those together work very nicely. I might want to bring up this line by the leg. And doing this sort of work, you can clean up any of those small little areas and just bump up the realism and make your painting look that much more polished. I'll go around the leg, clear out some of this blobby stuff by the branch. Tiny, tiny little things like this. Take as much time as you want doing those little finishing touches. And then, since we taped the borders, we get to do this fun step at the very end, which is taking off your tape and getting to see how the painting is going to look in a frame. Ta-da! So here's our original photo reference, and here's the painting. So you can see that using that masking fluid to really protect the foreground elements to keep them sharp is definitely the way to go when you have a nice atmospheric, smeary, blurry kind of background going on. That allows you the freedom that you need to get these really interesting effects back here and to still keep a lot of sharp detail on the focus in the on the elements in the foreground. So that is all you need to know about how to paint this bird on a twig. I really encourage you to try it at your own home. So you can download this photo reference, print it out, and take your hand at it. Just make sure that you take a lot of time on the drawing portion. This is going to be a really great one if you don't have a lot of experience drawing, because the drawing is relatively simple and the composition is still nice and strong. So I think you're going to be really pleased with your results. If you aren't, don't be afraid to try it more than once. You're going to learn something every time you paint it. Even if you paint the exact same thing 5 times in a row, no 2 of those are going to be the same, and you're going to take something away every time. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you join me again for another painting tutorial.